I begged my parents for money to save my son's life. My parents refused, then spent far more on my sister's lavish wedding. My child didn't survive. Years later, when the same people stood at my door desperate and afraid, I didn't cry or argue. I made one quiet choice that changed everything forever. Before I tell you the full story, do me a small favor. Tap subscribe and drop your city in the comments so I know how far the story travels. We don't have that kind of money just sitting around. You need to be realistic. My father stood rigid in the doorway of my apartment, arms crossed, voice firm and final. Behind him, my mother nodded in agreement, her expression tight with practiced sympathy. Neither of them looked past me, not toward the bedroom where my son lay fighting for air. I was 31 years old then. My name is Mara Collins, and I lived in a small, aging apartment in Lakeview Heights, teaching science at a public middle school. I was raising my son alone. His father disappeared 4 years earlier, the day doctors confirmed that our child's heart condition was rare, severe, and lifelong. He said he couldn't live that way. I stayed because there was no choice. On my kitchen table were stacks of medical bills, referral letters, insurance denials, and a handwritten note from the specialist. The number circled in red ink haunted me. $84,000. That was the cost of the experimental treatment that could slow my son's condition, maybe even save his life. Realistic. I repeated, my voice cracking despite every effort to stay composed. The doctor says without this treatment, Eli has 6 months, maybe less. My mother stepped forward and rested her hand lightly on my father's arm, the same gesture she used whenever she wanted to soften his refusal without contradicting him. We've already helped so much over the years, she said gently. 3 surgeries, Mara. We can't drain our retirement accounts. I'm not asking for that, I said quickly. I'm asking for a loan. I'll sign papers. I'll get a second job. I'll do anything. I'll pay you back. My father shook his head. You're barely staying afloat now. How would you realistically repay that kind of money? I've explored every option, I said. Payment plans take too long. Medical lenders won't approve me. The interest would bury me. He doesn't have years. He doesn't even have one. Silence filled the apartment. Then my father spoke again, slower, measured. We have to think about our future too. That sentence ended the conversation. They left shortly after. I stood at the window and watched their car disappear down the street, my chest tightening with each passing second. When the taillights vanished, I felt something heavy settle inside me. I walked into Eli's room and sat beside his bed. The oxygen machine hissed softly, pushing air into lungs that struggled to accept it. His small chest rose unevenly. He looked peaceful in sleep, unaware that his grandparents had just decided his life cost too much. The next morning, I started making calls. I reached out to extended family, old family friends, anyone who might help. Most offered sympathy. A few sent small amounts, $200, $500 with apologetic notes, saying they wished they could do more. I appreciated every dollar, but it felt like trying to empty a lake with a cup. 2 weeks later, Eli stopped breathing properly. His lips turned blue while I was heating soup on the stove. Panic ripped through me. I called emergency services, barely able to speak. At the hospital, they stabilized him, but the cardiologist pulled me aside afterward. His condition is deteriorating faster than expected, she said quietly. Without the treatment, I'd say 3 months at most. That night, I started an online fundraiser. I poured everything into the description. Photos of Eli smiling before the illness worsened, stories of how he loved building science kits and asking endless questions about the stars. Friends shared it. Teachers donated. Parents of my students helped. After 2 weeks, we had raised just under $13,000. It wasn't even close. Then my phone rang. It was my sister, Lena. Her voice burst with excitement. Mara, I have amazing news. Daniel proposed. We're getting married. I forced enthusiasm into my voice. That's great. Congratulations. And Mom and Dad are being so generous, she continued. They're paying for everything. No limits. We're thinking Europe. Maybe Italy or southern France. Can you imagine? No limits. I stood in my small apartment, medical bills covering every surface, my son struggling for every breath in the next room, and listened as my sister planned a wedding with an unlimited budget. Something cold formed in my chest. Not anger yet. Understanding. The months that followed blurred together. I sold everything of value I owned. Jewelry, furniture, heirlooms. I moved into a tiny studio apartment. I maxed out credit cards and took predatory loans. I worked until exhaustion became normal. Through it all, my sister's wedding plans grew larger and more extravagant. Every family gathering revolved around venues, tastings, floral designs. My parents traveled to tourist dates and sample menus that cost more than my monthly salary. They discussed details with enthusiasm, never once mentioning my son's declining health unless prompted. One evening, my mother called. Lena wants you as a bridesmaid, she said. The dress is $300. We need to order it soon. $300. That was nearly 2 weeks of Eli's medication. I don't think I can afford that, I said quietly. There was a pause. You're always focused on money, my mother replied. Life goes on, Mara. This is your sister's special day. After we hung up, I sat in the dark and cried until my chest hurt. By autumn, the doctors stopped talking about treatment. They talked about comfort. Eli stopped asking about school. He stopped talking about the future. Children know when time is running out. I took unpaid leave from work to stay with him, and as my son faded, my family finalized seating charts, menus, and dress fittings. They had already chosen what mattered most. I just didn't yet know how long it would take for that choice to come back to them. By October, the word hope stopped appearing in the doctor's vocabulary. They spoke in careful tones, choosing phrases meant to cushion impact, but nothing softened the truth. Eli's heart was failing faster than expected. The experimental treatment was no longer an option. We had missed the window while I scrambled for money that never came. The focus shifted to comfort. I learned how to read monitors the way other parents read bedtime stories. I memorized medication schedules, learned which alarms meant panic and which meant adjustment. I slept in a chair beside Eli's bed, waking every hour to check his breathing, his color, his pulse. My life narrowed to that hospital room. Meanwhile, my family's world expanded. My parents called occasionally, usually on their way to or from wedding-related errands. Their voices carried a brightness that felt almost cruel against the sterile hush of the ward. One afternoon, my mother called while I was sitting beside Eli, his hand curled weakly around my finger. We just finished a tasting, she said cheerfully. 5 different caterers. Lena wants a seafood station and a separate dessert bar. That sounds elaborate, I replied. Well, this is her once-in-a-lifetime day, she said. We want everything to be perfect. Perfect. Mara, he said breathless. Thank you. I was afraid you wouldn't. I've been thinking, I interrupted. If we're going to talk about money, we need to talk in person. All of us. Yes, he said quickly. Of course. Whatever you want. My place, I said. Saturday, 2 o'clock. We'll be there, he replied. Thank you. You don't know what this means. I hung up without responding. Saturday arrived gray and cold. I spent the morning preparing. Not emotionally, but practically. I set out 4 chairs in my living room. I placed a thick folder on the coffee table, the pages inside arranged in careful order. On top of it all, I laid a single check, face down. At exactly 2 o'clock, there was a knock. I opened the door. They stood there together, just as they always had when facing something uncomfortable. My father looked diminished, his shoulders slumped, his suit hanging loose. My mother's hair had gone mostly gray, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. My sister stood stiffly beside them, clutching an expensive purse like armor. "Mara," my mother said, stepping forward. I moved aside, letting them enter, but didn't return the gesture. "Sit," I said. They arranged themselves on my second-hand couch, close together, glancing at the folder on the table. My father cleared his throat. "We really appreciate you meeting with us." "You asked for help," I said evenly. "I agreed to talk. That's all." My mother folded her hands tightly in her lap. "Things have become very difficult." "I'm aware," I replied. "The foreclosure notice my father began." "I've seen it," I said. "Public records are very informative." He swallowed. "We owe about $90,000, he continued. "If we can cover that, we can keep the house. Anything helps." $90,000. More than what could have saved my son. I let the silence stretch. Finally, my mother spoke. "We wouldn't be here if we had any other option." I nodded slowly. "That sounds familiar." My sister shifted uncomfortably. "Mara, this doesn't need to be." "Quiet," I said, not raising my voice. She froze. I picked up the folder and opened it. "Before we discuss numbers," I said, "I have questions." I slid the first document across the table. "Do you remember this?" It was a printout of the estimate for Eli's treatment. The amount circled in red. $84,000. My mother's face drained of color. "Mara," my father said, his tone warning. "Answer the question," I said. "Do you remember this?" "Yes," he admitted. "Good," I replied. "Because I remember standing in your doorway, holding these papers, while you told me to be realistic." I pulled out another document. "This," I continued, "is the final invoice from Lena's wedding planner. Total cost, $230,000. Paid in full by you." My sister stood abruptly. "That's not fair." "Sit down," I said. She did. I laid out more pages. Venue, $80,000. Catering, $40,000. Flowers, $15,000. Dress, $12,000. Entertainment, $10,000. I placed each page carefully on the table. "You told me you couldn't afford to help your grandson," I said calmly. "But you could afford this." My mother began to cry. "We didn't know he would die," she whispered. "Yes, you did," I said. "The doctors told you." "I told you." My father leaned forward, anger flaring. "We made the best decision we could at the time." "For whom?" I asked. Silence. I pulled out a photo. Eli, 2 weeks before he died. Thin, pale, smiling weakly. "This," I said, "is who you decided wasn't worth it." My mother sobbed openly now. My sister stared at the floor. "We made mistakes," my father said hoarsely, "but we're asking for mercy." "Mercy," I repeated. Interesting word. I reached into the folder and turned it toward them. A check. $90,000. Hope exploded across their faces. "I'm willing to give you this," I said. My father exhaled sharply. My mother reached for his hand. "But," I continued, "there are conditions." "Anything," my father said immediately. "First," I said, "you acknowledge out loud that you had the money and chose to spend it on the wedding instead of saving Eli." My mother shook her head. "Mara." "Say it," I said. The room was silent. Finally, my father spoke. "We chose the wedding," he said quietly. "We had the money." And I prompted. "And Eli died without the treatment," he said. "Because we didn't help." I turned to my mother. "We should have saved him," she whispered. I turned to my sister. "And you?" She swallowed. I didn't ask questions." "That's your answer," I said. I stood. "Second condition," I continued. "You take this money, you save your house, and you never contact me again. No calls, no cards, no pretending we're a family." My mother gasped. "You can't mean that." "I do." I opened the door. "Take the check or leave it. You have 1 minute." They stared at each other, desperation outweighing pride. My father picked up the check. We accept, he said. I nodded. There's a document beside it. Sign it. They did without reading. When they finished, I handed my father the check. You can go now. They left in silence. I locked the door behind them, and for the first time in years I felt free. After they left, I didn't cry. That surprised me more than anything. I stood in the quiet of my apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside, and waited for the wave to come. The guilt, the doubt, the second-guessing everyone always warned would follow a decision like that. It never did. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar and steady settle into place. Not happiness, not relief, certainty. I sat down at the table and opened my laptop. There was still one thing left to do. I drafted an email I had written in pieces over the years, refining it quietly, waiting for the moment when it would matter. I addressed it to my Aunt Helen, the only relative who had shown genuine concern during Eli's illness, the only one who had ever sent money without conditions or commentary. Attached to the email was a document that IT was 37 pages long. Every conversation I could remember was there, dated and time-stamped where possible. Screenshots of messages, copies of medical estimates, bank statements showing the trickle of donations compared to the sudden flood of wedding expenses, photos of Eli in the hospital, a screenshot of my mother's social media post calling Lena's baby our first grandchild. I didn't embellish. I didn't editorialize. I didn't need to. Facts speak for themselves when laid out without apology. I wrote a short note above the attachment. Helen, I think the family deserves to know what really happened. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm asking you to read this and decide for yourself. Please share it with anyone you believe should see it. I hovered over the send button for a moment. Then I clicked it. I closed the laptop and went to bed. By morning, my phone was vibrating nonstop. I didn't answer it. I showered, got dressed, made coffee, and sat by the window watching the city wake up. It felt surreal, like the world had tilted and everyone else was scrambling to find their footing while I remained strangely balanced. The first message I read was from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Is this true? Then another. I had no idea. I'm so sorry. Then another. Why didn't anyone tell us? By noon, the messages blurred together. Shock, disbelief, anger. Some directed at my parents. Some at Lena. A few, predictably, at me. Family business shouldn't be aired like this. This feels cruel. You should have let the past stay buried. I ignored those. By late afternoon, the calls started. Not from my parents. They were still honoring the agreement for now. From others, a former neighbor, a church acquaintance, someone from the country club. Each conversation followed the same pattern. They asked if it was true. I said yes. They went quiet. That evening, Lena showed up at my door, alone. I looked through the peephole and felt nothing but mild curiosity. I opened the door but didn't step aside. You violated the agreement, she said immediately, her voice sharp, eyes blazing. I told the truth, I replied. That wasn't forbidden. You humiliated them, she snapped. Dad can't even show his face at the club. People are whispering. Friends are canceling invitations. I leaned against the doorframe. Did anyone whisper when my son died? That's not fair, she said. You're destroying their lives. No, I corrected calmly. I'm revealing them. She stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. You planned this, she said slowly. You waited. Yes, I agreed. You're cold, she said. No, I said. I'm finished. She stepped closer. Mom hasn't stopped crying. Dad looks broken. Was it worth it? I thought of Eli gasping for breath. I thought of the florist appointment. Yes, I said. She laughed bitterly. You really are heartless. My heart broke 4 years ago, I replied. You just weren't there to see it. She left without another word. Over the next few weeks, the fallout spread. My parents' social circle quietly distanced itself. Invitations stopped coming. The country club membership wasn't renewed. Church attendance became uncomfortable enough that they stopped going altogether. They kept the house, but it became something else entirely. Not a symbol of success. A reminder. My father found work eventually, consulting for a fraction of his former salary. My mother began therapy. Anxiety, insomnia, panic attacks. Words that suddenly became part of her vocabulary. Lena and her husband moved out of state within 6 months. Distance helps when reputations fray. As for me, I continued my life. I worked. I slept. I healed in ways I hadn't known were possible. I scattered Eli's ashes in places he would have loved. Near the ocean, beneath mountain skies, beside quiet forests where the world felt big enough to hold both grief and peace. I made friends who showed up without needing explanations. Friends who understood that silence can be a form of respect. I dated again, cautiously. I lived. The money I gave my parents nearly wiped out my savings, but I never regretted it. It bought something no amount of therapy or time ever could. Closure. They asked for help. I gave it on my terms, and then I walked away. Some people say forgiveness means forgetting. I disagree. Forgiveness, I learned, means telling the truth and refusing to carry someone else's guilt. They taught me that love had conditions. I simply returned the lesson, wrapped in a check they couldn't refuse and a truth they couldn't escape. And I moved forward, carrying my son's memory with me, finally unburdened. Time did something strange after that. It didn't heal everything the way people like to promise, but it softened the sharpest edges, dulled the constant ache enough that I could breathe without feeling like I was betraying my son by doing so. The world kept moving, indifferent as ever, and eventually I learned how to move with it instead of fighting against it every step of the way. I didn't hear directly from my parents after that meeting. They honored the agreement, not out of respect, I suspected, but out of necessity. Breaking it would have meant losing the last thing they had managed to preserve, the house, the illusion of stability. I heard about them through other people. A former neighbor mentioned my mother had stopped hosting dinners. Someone else said my father no longer attended golf outings. Their circle shrank quietly the way it does when people realize association carries discomfort. No public confrontation. No dramatic scenes. Just absence. That kind of silence can be louder than shouting. At work, life stabilized. I leaned into routine because routine doesn't ask questions. I showed up early, stayed late, poured myself into lesson plans and mentoring younger teachers. My promotion to assistant principal came sooner than I expected. It wasn't a victory. I didn't celebrate, but it was progress. Progress mattered. Money came more steadily. I rebuilt my savings slowly, methodically, with the same discipline I'd used before, but now without desperation driving every decision. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly calculating survival. Still, there were nights I woke up gasping, convinced I'd heard Eli coughing. I kept his room untouched longer than I should have. His shoes still lined the closet floor. His drawings stayed taped to the fridge. Grief doesn't leave when it's told to. It stays until it decides you've learned what it came to teach. One evening, months after everything unraveled, I received a letter. Handwritten. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the counter for 2 days, weighing more than paper ever should. When I finally did, I read it standing up, prepared to tear it apart if I needed to. She wrote about regret, about sleepless nights, about how she replayed conversations she wished she could undo. She wrote that she thought about Eli every day now, that she saw his face everywhere. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for understanding. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Understanding doesn't require proximity. I never responded. Winter passed. Spring arrived. On the anniversary of Eli's death, I took the day off work and drove to the coast. I walked along the shoreline and let the wind sting my face. I spoke to him out loud, not prayers, just memories. The things I wished he'd had. The things I wished I'd been able to give him. I didn't promise him justice. I promised him peace. Lena reached out once more that year, an email this time. She said becoming a mother had changed her, that she finally understood fear, that she hoped one day we could talk. I read it once. Then I archived it. Understanding someone doesn't obligate reconciliation. People confuse the two because it's easier than accepting permanent consequences. Life continued to rebuild itself around me in unexpected ways. I moved to a brighter apartment. I adopted a rescue dog that followed me from room to room like a shadow. I started saying yes to invitations again. I laughed sometimes without guilt. And slowly, the version of myself who lived only in survival mode began to fade. I didn't forget. I integrated. Then, nearly 2 years after that final meeting, something unexpected happened. I ran into my father. It was at a grocery store across town when I rarely visited. I was comparing prices when I felt someone standing too close behind me. Mara. I turned. He looked smaller than I remembered. Older. The confidence that once defined him was gone, replaced by something fragile. I won't stay long, he said quickly. I wanted to see you. I nodded, but didn't step closer. I know I shouldn't be here, he continued. I know what we agreed. I just wanted to tell you, the house is still standing. But everything else, he shook his head. I waited. We talk about Eli now, he said quietly. Every day. That surprised me. Too late, I said. Yes, he agreed. Silence stretched between us. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. I don't deserve it. That's the first honest thing you've said to me in years, I replied. He nodded, eyes wet. I hope you're happy. I thought about that. I'm at peace, I said. That seemed to satisfy him more than happiness ever could. He walked away without another word. I didn't look back. Later that year, I traveled overseas for the first time. I stood on cliffs overlooking the ocean and scattered a small portion of Eli's ashes into the wind. I imagined him laughing, free, unburdened by machines and monitors. For the first time since his death, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was living, for both of us. Some stories don't end with reconciliation. Some end with boundaries. Mine ended with truth, consequences, and the quiet strength of walking away without looking back. Peace is not loud. I learned that slowly over months that no longer revolved around emergencies or fear. Peace doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with certainty or relief. It slips in quietly, almost unnoticed, until one day you realize you can breathe without bracing yourself for impact. After I ran into my father at the grocery store, I expected something to unravel inside me. It didn't. What surprised me most was how little power that encounter had over my life now. Once, seeing him would have sent me spiraling. Rage, grief, 1,000 questions crashing at once. Instead, it felt like looking at a photograph from a different lifetime. Familiar, but no longer attached to my present. That was when I knew something fundamental had shifted. Work became more than a distraction. I had taken on the role of assistant principal with caution at first, worried I was filling my life with responsibility simply to avoid emptiness. But as time passed, I realized I was good at it, not because I was strict or commanding, but because I listened. Children noticed that, especially the ones who are hurting. I found myself drawn to the students others labeled difficult, the quiet ones who slept in class, the angry ones who lashed out, the ones whose parents never answered phone calls. I recognized the look in their eyes. Fear masked as indifference. Pain disguised as defiance. I never told them my story. I didn't need to. Empathy doesn't require confession. Sometimes it only requires presence. Someone who doesn't flinch when things get uncomfortable. At home, the walls felt less heavy. I packed away some of Eli's things, not because I wanted to forget, but because I wanted to remember without breaking apart. His drawings went into a portfolio, his favorite books onto a shelf in the living room. I donated his clothes to families who needed them, whispering goodbye to each piece before it left my hands. The night I finally dismantled the oxygen machine, I cried harder than I had in months. But afterward, the apartment felt lighter. Not empty, just honest. My savings grew slowly again. I didn't rush it. I no longer believed money could save everything, but I knew what the absence of it could destroy. I lived simply, deliberately. No excess. No indulgence born from guilt. One afternoon, I received a call from my Aunt Helen. I wasn't sure if I should, she said cautiously, but I wanted you to know, people are still talking. I assumed they would, I replied. Your parents have become very isolated, she continued. Not just socially, emotionally. Your mother barely leaves the house. Your father, he's different, quieter, less certain of himself. I listened without reacting. You don't owe them anything, Helen added quickly. I hope you know that. I do, I said. After the call ended, I sat by the window and watched the rain streak down the glass. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just inevitability. They had lived for decades believing their choices existed in a vacuum, that comfort and status protected them from consequence. What they were learning now was that life keeps records even when people try to erase them. That winter, Lena sent a message I hadn't expected. It wasn't about reconciliation. It was about fear. She wrote that her daughter had been hospitalized with a high fever, that the waiting had terrified her, that she couldn't stop imagining worst-case scenarios. She said she finally understood what it meant to feel powerless. I'm not asking you to fix anything, she wrote. I just needed to say it out loud. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back one sentence. Fear doesn't excuse choices. She never replied. Spring returned again, softer this time. I took longer walks. I traveled more. I stopped apologizing for moments of happiness. Grief, I learned, does not diminish joy. It coexists with it, reshaping it into something deeper, more deliberate. On the 4th anniversary of Eli's death, I did something new. I volunteered. Not at a hospital, not at a grief center, at a foundation that helped families navigate medical funding, applications, appeals, timelines. I helped parents understand the systems that had nearly crushed me. I showed them how to ask questions, how to push back, how to document everything. And when I couldn't help them win, I stayed anyway. Sometimes that mattered more. One evening after a long shift, I sat alone in my car, hands resting on the steering wheel, and felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of clarity. This was what survival had been leading to. Not punishment, not vindication. Purpose. Months later, another letter arrived. This one was from my father. Short, direct, no sentimentality. He wrote that my mother's health had declined. Anxiety had turned into something more serious. He didn't ask for help. He didn't ask to see me. He simply wrote, I needed you to know. I folded the letter and placed it in a box with the others. Knowing is not the same as returning. That summer, I received an offer for a full principal position at a larger school district. The salary was higher, the responsibility heavier. I accepted. The move meant a new apartment, new routines, new faces. It meant leaving behind the last physical spaces that held memories of survival. I didn't hesitate. On my last night in the old apartment, I stood in the empty living room and whispered goodbye. Not to the place, but to the version of myself who had endured there. She had done her job. I didn't need her armor anymore. The new city welcomed me without ceremony. I furnished slowly, carefully. I planted a small garden on the balcony, something I'd always wanted but never allowed myself before. I dated someone briefly, kind, steady. It didn't last, but it reminded me I was capable of connection without fear. One evening, while sorting old paperwork, I came across the signed agreement, the one my parents had signed without reading. No contact. Final. I read it again, not with bitterness but with gratitude. Boundaries are not punishments. They are protections. As years passed, my parents faded further from my life. I heard through Helen that they rarely hosted visitors now, that conversations often stalled, that joy had become something they remembered rather than experienced. I didn't wish them suffering. I simply accepted reality. And then, one quiet autumn afternoon, something unexpected happened. A student knocked on my office door. She was pale, trembling, clutching her phone. "My brother is sick," she said. "My parents don't know what to do." I listened. I helped. And when she left, relief flooding her face, I sat alone and cried, not from grief, but from recognition. Eli had changed the trajectory of my life, not by surviving, but by shaping the woman who remained. I no longer measured justice by pain returned. I measured it by balance restored, by the quiet certainty that my son mattered, and that his story did not end with silence. Grief does not disappear. It changes shape. That was something no one ever told me. Something I learned only after years of living with it pressed against my ribs, like a second heart. In the beginning, grief was sharp and demanding. It stole sleep, appetite, breath. Later, it softened, not weaker, just quieter. It became something I carried rather than something that carried me. By the 5th year after Eli's death, I had stopped marking time by anniversaries alone. Life had reasserted itself in small, stubborn ways. Morning routines, meetings, laughter that arrived unannounced and stayed without guilt. I had become principal of a large middle school in the Northern District, a place with peeling paint and underfunded programs, but students who were fiercely alive. I worked long hours, not to escape myself, but because the work mattered, because it grounded me in something real. Children have a way of seeing through performance. They didn't know my story in detail, but they knew I listened. They knew I remembered names, noticed changes, asked questions adults often avoided. When students were sick, scared, or struggling, they came to my office not because I had answers, but because I didn't look away. That mattered more than authority ever could. At home, my life was quieter. The rescue dog I adopted years earlier had grown gray around the muzzle. My balcony garden flourished every spring. I traveled once a year, always somewhere Eli would have loved, places with open skies, science museums, or oceans he never got to see. I scattered his ashes slowly, deliberately, never all at once. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means trusting that memory can live without pain dominating it. I hadn't spoken to my parents in years. Their absence became normal, like an old scar that only ached when weather changed. Occasionally, I heard fragments through Aunt Helen. My mother's health remained fragile. My father worked part-time, his pride long stripped away. They lived smaller lives now. Not tragic, just diminished. Lena stayed distant. Her life moved forward in the way it always had. Busy, polished, carefully curated. I saw glimpses through mutual connections. Birthday parties, school recitals, vacations. A life untouched by reflection, as far as I could tell. I didn't envy it. I no longer wanted what she had. What surprised me most, years later, was how rarely I thought about punishment or balance anymore. Once, I had needed accountability like oxygen. Now it felt complete. The scales had settled. What remained was meaning. The foundation I volunteered with grew into something more. I began serving on its advisory board, helping design systems that protected families from being crushed by bureaucracy. We trained parents to advocate, to document, to push back before it was too late. I never told my story publicly. I didn't need to. Every time a child received care because a parent knew how to fight, that was enough. One evening, after a particularly long day, I found an envelope slipped under my apartment door. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Mara, your mother is very ill. The doctors say there isn't much time. She asks about you constantly. She knows she has no right to ask, but she hopes you might come. If only once. Helen." I read the letter 3 times. Then I set it down and stared at the wall. This was the moment people imagine when they talk about forgiveness. The cinematic crossroads where the injured party must decide whether to return, to heal old wounds, to offer comfort at the end. But real life isn't a movie. Real life carries context. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel fear. I felt weight. I took 2 days off work and drove to a small coastal town where I had scattered Eli's ashes years earlier. I walked the beach alone, shoes in hand, the cold water biting at my ankles. I spoke to my son out loud, not asking permission, asking clarity. And what came was quiet certainty. I drove back. I did not go to the hospital. I did not call. Understanding someone's pain does not require proximity. Love does not obligate self-erasure. My mother passed away 3 weeks later. I found out through a short message from Helen. She went peacefully, it read. She talked about Eli near the end. I closed my eyes and let the moment pass through me. Grief returned, but not the same way. This grief was older, layered, carrying echoes of everything that had been unresolved. I allowed myself to mourn not just my mother, but the version of her I had needed and never had. Both losses mattered. The funeral was small. I did not attend. Lena gave the eulogy. My father did not speak. Afterward, Helen told me my name had come up more than once, spoken softly with regret. Regret does not change outcomes. It only acknowledges them. Months passed. Then one afternoon my father called. I almost didn't recognize the number. I answered before I could overthink it. "Mara," he said, his voice fragile in a way I had never heard before. "I don't know why I'm calling. I know I shouldn't." I stayed silent. "Your mother," he stopped. "She knew she failed you. She said it over and over. She wanted me to tell you that." "I know," I said. There was a long pause. "I don't expect anything," he said. I just needed you to know." "I do know," I replied. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. I thought about it. "Yes," I said. "I am." He exhaled shakily. "I'm glad," he said. That was the last conversation we ever had. He died a year later. Heart attack. I learned about it through a forwarded obituary. I read it once. Then I closed the page. Time did what it always does. It moved forward. Lena sent a message after his death. Not asking forgiveness. Not asking for reconciliation. Just 3 words. "I understand now." I didn't respond. Understanding that arrives too late does not require acknowledgement. Years continued to pass. I grew older, softer in some ways, stronger in others. The students I helped began to graduate. Some came back years later to tell me they remembered how I listened, how I stayed late, how I believed in them when they felt invisible. One young woman hugged me once and said, "You saved my brother." I went home and cried harder than I had in years. Not from sadness, from meaning. On the 10th anniversary of Eli's death, I did something I had never done before. I wrote about him, not publicly, for myself. I wrote about his laugh, the way he asked impossible questions, the way he loved the stars. I wrote about the machines, the hospital rooms, the nights I held his hand and promised things I couldn't deliver. I wrote about the choices that had been made, and I wrote about what came after. At the end of the page, I wrote one sentence. Your life mattered more than their comfort. And I knew it was true. My family line ended with me. Not out of bitterness, out of intention. I built something new instead. Community, purpose, continuity that didn't rely on blood. I became the adult I needed when everything fell apart. And in doing so, I ensured that Eli's life echoed forward. Not through legacy or inheritance, but through impact. The world did not bend to my grief, but it did not erase it either. Balance was restored, not through cruelty, but through truth, boundaries, and time. And as I stood on my balcony one quiet evening, watching the city lights blink on, I felt something rare and precious settle over me. Not victory, not absolution. Peace. There is a moment that comes after everything has already happened, after the apologies that came too late, after the silence settled where arguments used to live. It's the moment when you realize the story no longer owns you. You own it. I didn't notice when that moment arrived. It didn't announce itself. It came disguised as an ordinary Tuesday, a stack of paperwork on my desk, a knock on my office door from a student asking if they could talk. They always ask that way. Do you have a minute? I always said yes. That afternoon, a 7th grade boy sat across from me, shoulders hunched, hands clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. His younger sister had been diagnosed with a chronic illness. His parents were terrified. They didn't know how they were going to manage the appointments, the costs, the fear. As he spoke, something inside me shifted. Not painfully, not sharply, but with recognition. I pulled out a legal pad and started writing. Names, questions to ask doctors, programs to apply for, words to use when insurance companies tried to delay. His shoulders relaxed as he watched me. Why do you know all this? He asked quietly. I paused. Because someone once needed me to, I said. That was enough. When he left, I sat alone for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me. I realized then that the story no longer lived only in the past. It had become a tool, one I could use to steady others when the ground beneath them started to crack. That realization changed how I carried my days. I stopped thinking of Eli only as the child I lost. I began to see him as the reason something better existed now. I was careful not to turn him into a symbol. He had been a real child, messy, curious, stubborn, endlessly alive even when his body was failing him. But his life had altered mine in ways that rippled outward, touching people he never met. That mattered. The foundation grew larger. Grants increased. Systems improved. Parents learned how to advocate earlier, harder. Children received care sooner. Sometimes the outcomes were still heartbreaking, but fewer were preventable. That difference mattered more than recognition ever could. I was invited once to speak at a conference on education and family advocacy. I declined. I didn't want a stage. I wanted continuity. The kind that happens quietly when systems shift just enough to catch someone before they fall. At home, life remained deliberately simple. I didn't accumulate things. I accumulated moments. Walks with my dog as he slowed with age. Dinners with friends who knew when not to ask questions. Letters from former students who remembered being seen. One winter evening, I received an email from a woman whose name I didn't recognize. Her subject line read, "You don't know me, but..." She wrote that she'd received my Aunt Helen's forwarded document years earlier. That at the time, she'd been struggling to decide whether to ask her own parents for help with her child's medical needs. She said reading the truth, laid out so plainly, had changed her approach. She demanded accountability. She documented everything. She refused to be dismissed. Her child survived. I read the email twice. Then I closed my laptop and let the tears come. Not grief tears. Gratitude tears. I never responded. I didn't need to. Some messages exist simply to arrive. Years continued to pass. My dog died quietly one spring morning, his head resting on my foot. I buried him beneath a tree that caught the sun just right in the afternoons. Loss never stops visiting, but it becomes less frightening when you know you can survive it. Lena reached out once more, years after our last contact. This time, it wasn't about her parents. It was about herself. She wrote that her marriage had ended, that motherhood had changed her, that she carried guilt she didn't know how to set down. She didn't ask for absolution. She asked for perspective. I sat with her message for days. Then I wrote back one sentence. You have to live with what you chose and with what you didn't. She replied only once. I am. We never spoke again. I didn't feel cruel. I felt honest. Boundaries don't exist to punish. They exist to protect what remains. As I moved deeper into my 40s, my life took on a rhythm I cherished. Early mornings, strong coffee, quiet evenings, purposeful work, deep rest. I dated occasionally, but I never rushed connection. I no longer feared loneliness. I understood its difference from solitude. Solitude is chosen. Loneliness is imposed. I had chosen my life. One autumn afternoon, while cleaning out old boxes, I found the notebook I had started years ago, the one where I'd written every refusal, every expense, every date. I flipped through the pages slowly. I expected anger. What I felt instead was distance. Not emotional distance, temporal distance. That person, the woman who had written those pages, had been fighting for survival. She had done everything she could with the tools she had at the time. She deserved grace. I closed the notebook and placed it back in the box, not because I wanted to forget, but because I no longer needed to reference it. Memory had moved from evidence to history. On the anniversary of Eli's birth, I began a quiet tradition. I took the day off. I visited a place of learning, a planetarium, a science center, a library, somewhere he would have loved. I watched children ask questions. I watched parents kneel to listen. And I smiled. The world had not become kinder, but I had. And sometimes that was enough to tilt the balance. Near the end of that year, I received news through Helen that my parents' house had finally been sold. Downsized. The last physical symbol of their former life gone. I felt nothing sharp about it, only inevitability. We all live inside the consequences of what we prioritize. Some consequences arrive quickly. Others take years, but they always arrive. One night, lying awake, I thought about the word people often used when talking about stories like mine. Closure. I used to believe closure was something you reached, a place you arrived at where pain no longer existed. I know better now. Closure is not the absence of pain. It is the presence of understanding. I understood what happened. I understood why. And I understood that I had acted in alignment with my values when it mattered most, both when I asked for help and when I chose myself later. That alignment is what allows sleep to come easily. That alignment is what allows peace to settle. Eli's life did not end in silence. It echoed through systems changed, through children helped, through a woman who refused to disappear quietly when she was told to be realistic about losing her child. The story was no longer about what my family had done. It was about what I'd built afterward. And that was something no one could take from me. There is a strange quiet that arrives when a story is finally finished. Not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that settles after something has been fully said, after nothing important remains unspoken. I didn't recognize that quiet at first. It came disguised as ordinary days strung together without crisis, without anticipation, without fear crouched behind every thought. It came as normalcy. I woke early. I drank my coffee slowly. I went to work. I returned home, tired in a way that felt earned rather than depleted. And one evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the lights of the city blink on one by one, I realized something that stopped me cold. I was no longer waiting for anything. For years, my life had been shaped by waiting. Waiting for test results. Waiting for bills. Waiting for help that never came. Waiting for consequences. Waiting for the moment when everything would finally make sense. But now, there was nothing left to wait for. Everything that needed to happen had already happened. I thought about Eli, not with the sharp ache that once stole my breath, but with a warmth that surprised me. I could remember his laugh without flinching. I could picture his hands building impossible structures from mismatched pieces, his face lighting up when something finally clicked. Memory had softened into something livable. I had feared for a long time that peace would feel like betrayal, that if I ever felt okay again, it would mean I had left him behind. I know now that peace doesn't erase love. It proves it endured. On a quiet Saturday morning, I visited the small wooden box where I kept the few things I never parted with. His hospital bracelet, a folded drawing of planets he'd colored unevenly, a note I'd written to myself the night after he died, barely legible through tears. I read it once more. You did everything you could. For years, I hadn't believed that sentence. Now I did. Life continued to expand in ways I hadn't planned but had grown to welcome. I was asked to mentor new administrators. I helped design district-wide support protocols for families dealing with medical emergencies. I watched systems shift, slowly, imperfectly, but measurably. Change doesn't roar. It accumulates. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered what would have happened if my parents had chosen differently. If Eli had received the treatment. If my family had rallied instead of retreating into comfort and appearances. Those thoughts no longer haunted me. They simply existed. Hypotheticals lose their power when reality has been fully lived. I never reconciled with my sister. I never reunited with my parents. I did not attend funerals or seek closure through last conversations. That used to trouble me. It doesn't anymore. People misunderstand forgiveness. They imagine it as reunion, as restored proximity, as shared holidays and softened smiles. But forgiveness is not an obligation to re-enter harm. Sometimes, forgiveness is the refusal to carry anger forward while still choosing distance. Sometimes it is letting the truth stand without needing to revisit it. I forgave myself. That mattered most. One spring afternoon, a former student, now a young adult, visited my office. She told me she was studying nursing. She said she remembered the day I'd sat with her family and helped them navigate insurance appeals when her brother was sick. You made it feel possible, she said, even when it wasn't easy. After she left, I closed my door and cried. Not because I was sad, because I understood something deeply, fully and without doubt. Eli's life had mattered, not because it had been long, but because it had changed me, and through me it had touched others. Legacy is not about names remembered. It's about impact carried forward. Years earlier, I had written everything down because I was afraid of being erased. Afraid that if I didn't document the truth, it would be rewritten or forgotten. I don't fear that anymore. The truth lives in me. It lives in the work I do, in the choices I make, in the boundaries I hold without apology. It lives in every moment I choose integrity over convenience. The people who failed me are gone now. Some physically, some emotionally, some by their own choices. I don't hate them. I don't excuse them. I understand them. And I understand myself better. If there is one thing this journey taught me, it's this. Love is not proven by words or traditions or bloodlines. It is proven by action, especially when action is costly. When the moment comes that requires sacrifice, the truth of who we are is revealed. That moment came for my family. They chose comfort. I chose my child. And later, when the moment came again, when they needed me, I chose truth, boundaries, and accountability. I didn't mirror their cruelty. I reflected their priorities. There is a difference. Now, when I think of the woman I once was, the one standing in a kitchen filled with bills, begging to be heard, I feel tenderness instead of grief. She survived something that should have broken her. She carried her child through unbearable loss and still found a way forward. She learned that justice does not always arrive quickly, loudly, or with spectacle. Sometimes it arrives quietly, years later, in the form of choice reclaimed. This story does not end with reconciliation. It ends with clarity. It ends with peace that was earned, not gifted. And it ends with a promise I continue to keep, to live fully, to act honestly, and to never look away when someone asks for help and time is running out. If my story moved you, challenged you, or made you think differently about family, choice, and accountability, stay with this channel and share where you're watching from. Stories like this survive only when they're told. And sometimes they help someone else find the courage to choose differently when it matters most.